The winter sky over occupied France was gray and unforgiving. Snow clouds hung low, swallowing sound and color alike, turning the land beneath into a silent, endless shadow. It was 1943, and the war had reached a rhythm of exhaustion, men and machines locked in a cycle of destruction. But that morning, something unusual appeared above the clouds, something the Germans had never seen so close before. From the west came a deep, thunderous growl. It was not the heavy drone of a bomber formation, nor the sharp whine of a Messerschmitt. This was a single engine, powerful and confident, tearing through the sky like a storm. Ground observers at first thought it was an American escort fighter returning from a raid. But what was it doing alone, this far from its group? The aircraft was a P-47 Thunderbolt, one of the Allies' newest and most formidable machines. Its wide frame and massive radial engine made it a flying fortress in its own right. The Germans had heard rumors of its strength, that it could dive faster than any Luftwaffe fighter, that its engine could take bullets and still fly home. To them, it was more legend than aircraft, a ghost of American engineering, unstoppable, untouchable. Yet that morning the ghost stumbled. Somewhere near the French countryside, local farmers heard a strange sound. A sudden sputter, then silence. Moments later, the roar returned, broken and uneven. The plane circled low, barely keeping altitude. Its silver wings glinted briefly through the mist before it disappeared beyond a line of dark trees. Then came the crash, distant, heavy, final. When German patrols arrived hours later, they found wreckage scattered across a frozen field. But what shocked them most was not the destruction. It was the state of the aircraft itself. Despite the crash, the P-47 was remarkably intact. Its fuselage was bent but not shattered. The cockpit, though cracked, was still sealed. The body looked almost deliberate, as if the plane had been forced down gently rather than destroyed. The pilot was gone. No sign of struggle, no body, no blood. Only an empty parachute harness tangled among the debris. To the soldiers on the ground, it was as if the man had vanished into thin air. Rumors spread quickly through the German ranks. Some said the pilot had escaped. Others whispered that it was an unmanned plane, a decoy, sent by the Allies for reasons no one could guess. Luftwaffe intelligence officers arrived the next morning. They moved with precision, photographing, measuring, cataloging every inch of the strange American craft. One of them, Major Ernst Lurk, a test pilot known for his calm mind and daring flights, was among the first to realize the significance of what they had found. "This is not a wreck," he murmured as he walked around the Thunderbolt's bent wings. "This is a message." Lurk had flown almost every German aircraft of the war, from the sleek Bf-109 to the deadly Fw-190, but the Thunderbolt's design fascinated him. Its construction was brutally efficient. Heavy armor, massive engine, and systems designed for endurance rather than elegance. Unlike the German fighters built for agility and speed, this American machine was built to survive. As he studied the twisted propeller and the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, Lurk couldn't help but feel a strange respect and a trace of fear. What kind of engineers had created this beast? And how had it managed to crash almost perfectly, leaving its secrets intact? The Luftwaffe officers ordered the wreckage transported to Rechlin, Germany's top-secret test facility. The logistics alone took days. The plane was too heavy to move easily, and its parts had to be disassembled carefully. But the order came from high command: recover everything. No part is to be left behind. In the quiet of the French countryside, the local villagers watched as German trucks carried away the strange American machine under canvas tarps. To them, it looked like the ghost of a fallen giant being taken to its grave. Back in Berlin, whispers spread through the Luftwaffe's intelligence circles. The Americans had lost one of their most advanced fighters behind enemy lines, but was it really an accident? Some officers believed it was bait, a trap to mislead German engineers with false data or hidden flaws. Others saw it as an opportunity, a rare chance to look inside the mind of the enemy. For Major Lurk, it was something else entirely. As the trucks rolled out toward Germany, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just transporting an aircraft. He was transporting an idea, one that could change everything he thought he knew about flight, power, and war itself. That night, as he stood on the airfield watching the convoy disappear into the snowy distance, the sky above rumbled faintly again, the sound of another Allied raid passing overhead. Lurk looked up into the darkness and whispered to himself, "If this is their machine, then what else are they hiding up there?" In that moment, the German pilot didn't yet realize that the captured P-47 would become the most mysterious aircraft of his career, and perhaps the most dangerous. For now, the ghost over Europe was silent, but its story had only just begun. The train carrying the captured P-47 Thunderbolt arrived at Rechlin, Germany's top-secret test base, under a pale winter sky. Frost clung to the rails, and the air smelled of fuel and metal. A small group of Luftwaffe officers waited silently as the crates were unloaded. They all knew what this was: an American machine whole enough to fly, a prize rarer than gold. The P-47 had been forced down weeks earlier near the French border after a dogfight. The pilot, wounded but alive, had been taken prisoner. But the real capture was the aircraft itself. Reports described it as nearly indestructible, a metal fortress that could take hits from 20mm cannons and still return home. Now, for the first time, German engineers would see the secret for themselves. When the tarp came off, even the most stoic officers fell silent. Before them stood a giant. Its massive fuselage, thick armor, and radial engine gave it the presence of a battleship among fighters. The black-painted cross of the Luftwaffe had not yet been added, and the stars and bars of the U.S. Air Force still faintly showed under the dirt. Major Ernst Lurk, one of Germany's most trusted test pilots, stepped closer, studying the machine with calm precision. He had flown every enemy aircraft the Luftwaffe had captured: Spitfires, Mustangs, even a B-17. But this looked different. It looked like something designed not merely to win a fight, but to survive it. He ran his hand across the thick metal skin. "They built it like a tank," he murmured. His colleague, Engineer Wilhelm Fischer, nodded. "Yes, Major. It's heavy, too heavy for our standards. But if it truly flies well with that weight, then we have something to learn." Inside the hangar, the disassembly began. Panels were removed carefully, every bolt catalogued. The German engineers examined the engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800, a 2,000 horsepower monster of American industry. They were astonished by its simplicity and resilience. No intricate tubing, no fragile designs like in their own Daimler-Benz engines. It was practical, brutal, and reliable. Even damaged, this engine could keep running, Fisher whispered. That explains how their pilots make it home. Days turned into weeks. The Thunderbolt was cleaned, repaired, and repainted in neutral gray. The engineers replaced bullet-torn panels and fitted new tires scavenged from other planes. In the evenings, Lurk would sit in the cockpit, studying the instruments by lamplight. The gauges were basic but clear, built for pilots under pressure. Everything about the aircraft told a story of endurance, a philosophy different from the Luftwaffe's obsession with precision and lightness. Outside, the war was changing. Allied bombers filled the skies. The Luftwaffe was stretched thin, its fuel supplies dwindling, its veteran pilots lost. Each new Allied aircraft that appeared over Germany felt like another nail in the coffin. The Thunderbolt, now sitting silently in the hangar, symbolized that shift, the power of an industrial giant the Germans could not match. Still, the test team continued. They rewired the cockpit, replaced the American instruments with metric ones, and painted black crosses over the faded U.S. insignia. The once-enemy plane now wore German colors. Some soldiers laughed nervously, calling it the American Ghost. Others whispered that it was cursed, a symbol of defeat hidden under new paint. On a gray morning, the final preparations were complete. Lurk climbed into the cockpit, the cold leather of his flight gloves creaking. He adjusted the seat, checked the flaps, and stared at the engine switches. Around him, the mechanics stepped back. Silence filled the hangar except for the wind howling through the doors. He pressed the starter. The propeller turned once, twice, then coughed alive in a roar of thunder. Flames burst briefly from the exhaust, and the smell of burnt oil filled the air. The P-47's engine came to life like a sleeping beast awakened from captivity. Every man in that hangar felt something strange, awe mixed with unease. It was as if they had just resurrected an enemy soul. The aircraft trembled, powerful and defiant. No longer American, yet not truly German either. Lurk throttled up gently. The plane rolled forward, its heavy landing gear biting into the frozen ground. For a brief moment, the Major felt a flicker of excitement, the thrill of understanding something forbidden. This was not merely an aircraft. It was a glimpse into the mind of the enemy, a machine built by a nation that fought with industry, not just courage. He shut down the engine and climbed out slowly. Around him, the engineers clapped softly, but Lurk remained quiet. His eyes stayed fixed on the Thunderbolt's darkened cockpit. "We've captured more than a plane," he said at last. "We've captured their philosophy, how they fight, how they think. And it's terrifying." No one replied. Outside, bombers droned faintly in the distance, crossing the horizon toward another German city. The Thunderbolt sat gleaming in the pale light, a silent warning. For the Luftwaffe, this was not just a trophy. It was the prize of the enemy, and a mirror showing what Germany could no longer become. The decision to move the captured P-47 Thunderbolt from the forward base to Rechlin, Germany's most secretive testing ground, was made in absolute silence. No documents, no radio chatter, only a handful of high-ranking officers and engineers knew. To the Luftwaffe, this aircraft was not just a trophy anymore. It was a key that could unlock the secrets of American air superiority. But secrecy came with risk. By 1944, Allied reconnaissance aircraft filled the skies, and every train track, every airfield was watched. Moving a fully intact enemy fighter across a war-torn nation was madness, but it had to be done. The operation began before dawn. The Thunderbolt was dismantled piece by piece. Wings detached, propeller packed in a wooden crate, engine secured in a steel frame. Every part was labeled with false codes to hide its identity. Even the workers who loaded the parts were told they were moving damaged German equipment. In the dim light of morning, a special military train began its slow journey north. Guards rode in silence, rifles ready, eyes scanning the skies. At every stop, the cargo was inspected, papers signed with forged stamps, and questions silenced with authority. Inside one of the freight cars, wrapped under thick tarps, the fuselage of the P-47 rested like a sleeping beast. The black smoke of the locomotive mixed with the cold mist, leaving the countryside behind in gray shadows. Major Ernst Lurk sat in the last car, watching through the narrow slit of a window. He was restless. He knew that if the Allies discovered this transport, the train would never reach Rechlin. The Americans bombed anything that moved: bridges, stations, even convoys of refugees. A single patrol could expose the operation. But beyond fear, Lurk felt something else, a growing curiosity. He wanted to fly that machine, to understand how it could carry such weight and still climb like a bird. What kind of thinking created such power? At dusk, the train reached Leipzig, where it would change lines. The station was half destroyed from air raids. Cranes moved slowly among the ruins, loading and unloading military supplies under the dull glow of lanterns. The soldiers guarding the Thunderbolt worked fast, speaking in whispers. Every moment felt borrowed. Then, without warning, sirens screamed. The night lit up as Allied bombers appeared overhead. The guards froze, staring at the black silhouettes crossing the moon. The first explosions came seconds later, thunder rolling across the yard. Fire lit the sky as warehouses burned, and shockwaves shook the train. Lurk jumped from the carriage and shouted for his men. "Keep it covered. If we lose this, we lose everything." Flames raged only a few hundred meters away. The crew rushed to protect the crates, throwing sand and tarps over them. A bomb fell close. The ground lifted, and shrapnel tore through the air. Smoke, fire, and chaos swallowed the night. When the attack ended, half the station was gone. Several guards were wounded, but miraculously, the crates carrying the Thunderbolt remained intact. Lurk stood among the debris, coughing through the dust. He looked at the scorched tarps and blackened metal and whispered, almost to himself, "It survives even through our bombs, just like the ones they fly." The train departed again at dawn, slower now, its engine damaged but still pushing forward. For 2 more days, it crossed Germany in near silence, through fields, forests, and ghost towns. Civilians watched the passing convoy with hollow eyes. The war had drained everything from the land: hope, fuel, even color. By the time they reached Rechlin, snow had begun to fall. The base, hidden deep in the woods north of Berlin, stood as the beating heart of Germany's aviation secrets. Here, every captured enemy machine was studied, tested, and flown to its limits. Guards checked every document twice before allowing the convoy through. The crates were unloaded carefully into Hangar 7, the same hangar where once the first jet prototypes had been born. The men worked quietly, aware of the importance of what they carried. When the last crate was unsealed, and the body of the P-47 lay exposed under the white light, Lurk felt the weight of the moment. This was no longer a rumor or a legend from the front lines. It was real. The enemy's creation stood before him, almost defiant. Over the next days, teams of engineers assembled the aircraft under Lurk's supervision. They reattached the wings, rewired the controls, and restored the engine. Even damaged, the Thunderbolt seemed unbreakable. The mechanics muttered in disbelief at its construction. Every bolt oversized, every panel reinforced. To Lurk, it felt as though the Americans had designed this plane not just to fight, but to endure, to outlast the war itself. When the restoration was finally complete, the P-47 stood tall again, its presence dominating the hangar. The German insignia had not yet been painted on. It still bore the faint shadow of the U.S. star, like a ghost of its origin. That night, Lurk wrote in his private logbook, "The machine has arrived intact. The strength is unlike anything in our inventory. If this is what the Americans build in hundreds, then our struggle is already written. Still, I will fly it, and perhaps understand what gives it life." The Thunderbolt slept in silence, its polished metal reflecting the flicker of oil lamps. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen airfield. Germany was dying, but here, in this hangar, the Luftwaffe had captured a fragment of the enemy's power. Prize, yes, but one that whispered of something greater. Not just the prize of the enemy, but a mirror showing the limits of their own world. The morning air at Rechlin Air Base was cold and still. A thin fog drifted across the runway, and the distant hum of engines echoed like ghosts in the mist. Inside Hangar 7, the captured P-47 Thunderbolt stood fully assembled, its metallic skin gleaming under the pale light. The black crosses of the Luftwaffe had now been painted on its wings, a foreign symbol on an American heart. Major Ernst Lurk stood beside the plane, clipboard in hand, while engineers made final checks. The aircraft had been restored with precision, every wire, every bolt verified twice. Yet, beneath the excitement, there was tension. Everyone knew that what they were about to do was dangerous. Lurk was scheduled to perform the first test flight the following morning. It was not the first time he had flown an enemy aircraft, but the scale of this one unsettled him. The P-47 was massive, heavier than anything he had handled. Even the mechanics called it the flying tank. But before the test, there was a meeting, one that would plant a shadow of doubt in every man in that hangar. That evening, Colonel Heinrich Vogel, head of the Luftwaffe's Technical Intelligence Unit, arrived at Rechlin. A tall, gaunt man with a face carved by sleepless nights, he had been briefed on the Thunderbolt's recovery and reconstruction. He walked around the plane silently, his boots echoing on the hangar floor. Finally, he turned to Lurk. "Major," he said quietly, "you understand what this flight represents?" "Yes, sir. We're here to learn from the enemy, to understand what makes this machine so unstoppable." Vogel studied him for a long moment before replying. "Be careful what you try to understand. Sometimes, learning too much from the enemy makes you forget who you are." Lurk frowned. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "Granted. I don't believe there's danger in understanding, Colonel. Knowledge is our only weapon left." Vogel's lips curved into a thin smile. "Perhaps, but this plane, it's not just an engine and wings. It's the result of a way of thinking that has already defeated us. Industrial power, not heroism. Quantity, not sacrifice. Every time you sit in that cockpit, remember you are not the one in control. The enemy is." The words sank deep. Lurk didn't respond. He simply turned back to the P-47, watching the light fade on its steel body. That night he couldn't sleep. He walked the perimeter of the airfield, listening to the wind howl across the hangars. In the distance, he could hear the dull thud of bombs. Another city under Allied attack. He thought of Vogel's warning. Could a machine carry the spirit of the nation that built it? Could flying the Thunderbolt make him feel American? Before dawn, the test crew assembled. The ground shimmered with frost. The P-47's propeller was turned by hand, and the mighty Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine roared to life, its sound echoing across the base. The sheer power shook the ground. Lurk climbed into the cockpit. The smell of oil and leather filled the air. The seat felt different, wide, solid, built for comfort and long missions. He adjusted the straps and glanced at the instruments. Everything was where it should be, except it wasn't German. The layout, the markings, even the throttle's weight felt alien. "Tower to test pilot. You are cleared for taxi," came the voice over the radio. Lurk responded calmly, his gloved hand tightening on the control stick. The Thunderbolt began to roll. Slowly, the giant moved across the frozen runway. To those watching, it was surreal, a German officer commanding an American war machine. He accelerated down the strip, the aircraft roaring like a beast unchained. The wheels left the ground, and for a moment, the P-47 hung in the air before climbing sharply into the fog. From the control tower, Vogel watched through binoculars. "He's up," an officer said. At 3,000 feet, Lurk eased the controls, testing the response. The Thunderbolt was sluggish at first but steady, powerful, predictable. Unlike German fighters, which demanded constant precision, this aircraft seemed to forgive mistakes. It didn't need finesse, it needed confidence. "This machine, it flies itself," Lurk murmured over the radio. "Heavy but stable. The engine doesn't strain. It breathes." He pushed higher into the gray sky. The altimeter climbed past 8,000 feet. He tested a roll, then a dive. The plane responded with smooth, unshakable grace. Even when he pushed beyond safe speed, the wings held firm. No vibration, no metal fatigue. On the ground, the engineers recorded every number. Fuel flow, climb rate, cooling temperature, all perfect. After 30 minutes, Lurk brought the Thunderbolt back to land. As the plane touched the ground, the entire hangar crew rushed forward. The test had been a complete success. But when Lurk climbed down, he didn't smile. His expression was distant, thoughtful. Vogel approached him. "Well, Major, what do you think of your prize?" Lurk wiped the oil from his gloves. "It's unnatural. It shouldn't be possible for something so heavy to feel so alive." Vogel nodded. "And that, Major, is the true danger. Machines like this don't rely on skill or spirit. They rely on the strength of nations. The Americans have built a weapon that fights without emotion. We have built ours with pride and sacrifice. And pride, I fear, can't outlast steel." The colonel turned away, leaving Lurk alone beside the P-47. The engine ticked as it cooled, the smell of fuel still thick in the air. For a long time, Lurk stood silently, staring at the black cross painted over the faded American star. He finally whispered to himself, "Maybe the colonel is right. Maybe we are flying into the future, but it doesn't belong to us." The fog closed around the runway again, and the distant hum of engines filled the sky. Allied bombers approaching another German city. And the Thunderbolt, silent and unmoving, seemed to listen. It had given its first warning. The test flight of the captured P-47 Thunderbolt had shocked everyone at Rechlin. For weeks, German engineers had studied the aircraft's design, each day uncovering something that challenged everything they believed about modern warfare. But for Major Ernst Lurk, the man who flew it, the real discovery came not from the sky, but from inside the beast itself. The day after the first flight, Lurk returned to Hangar 7 before sunrise. The base was quiet, covered in a thin layer of frost. Only the echo of his boots broke the silence. The P-47 stood in the center of the hangar like some sleeping giant, its polished fuselage glinting under the dim lamps. He climbed into the cockpit not to fly but to study. For hours he sat there, tracing every gauge, every switch, trying to understand the mind that built it. The first thing he noticed was the simplicity. Unlike German cockpits, filled with dozens of clustered instruments and delicate toggles, the American layout was intuitive, almost friendly. Everything the pilot needed was within easy reach. He muttered quietly to himself, "They designed this for men who don't have time to think, only to act." An engineer named Kurt Jansen, a young Luftwaffe mechanic with oil-stained hands, entered the hangar carrying a clipboard. "Morning, Major. Couldn't sleep again?" Lurk smiled faintly. "Not when I'm sitting inside something that feels alive." Kurt chuckled. "Alive? It's a machine, sir." Lurk turned toward him. "That's what worries me. Feels too human, too forgiving. Look at this layout, no complicated trim systems, no fragile controls. It's as if they wanted even a farm boy to become a pilot overnight." Kurt looked at the controls and nodded. "They build in mass, not perfection. Maybe that's why they're winning." The two men fell silent. Outside, the distant rumble of Allied bombers echoed, a sound that had become the rhythm of life in Germany. Later that day, Colonel Heinrich Vogel arrived with a group of intelligence officers. They carried notebooks, cameras, and measuring tools. They began photographing every inch of the Thunderbolt, discussing how to replicate its technology. Start with the engine, Vogel ordered. The R-2800 is the heart of their success. Double-row radial 18 cylinders, nearly 2,000 horsepower. That's more than any of our single-engine fighters can sustain. The engineers nodded and began disassembling panels. The more they uncovered, the more astonished they became. The cooling system, the robust hydraulic network, the heavy armor plating around the cockpit. Every part seemed built with one philosophy: survive first, fight second. Lurk watched them work, his mind racing. Our planes are built for agility, he said quietly. This one is built for endurance. You can shoot at it all day, and it still comes home. That afternoon, he performed another test flight, this time focusing on the Thunderbolt's dive capabilities. As he climbed above 20,000 feet, the sky turned crystal blue. Below him, Germany stretched out, towns, rivers, forests scarred by war. He pushed the throttle forward. The engine roared like thunder, and the plane began its descent. The speed climbed 400, 450, 500 miles per hour, faster than most German aircraft could withstand. But the P-47 didn't tremble. It stayed solid, steady. Inside, Lurk could feel the incredible strength of its frame. Even at terminal velocity, the wings didn't flutter. Unbelievable, he whispered. It dives like a stone but lands like a feather. When he leveled out, the G-forces pressed against his chest. Yet the aircraft responded smoothly. No stalls, no violentsjacks. It was as if the machine wanted to protect him. When he landed, Vogel was waiting. Well, Major, Lurk took off his helmet, his face pale but eyes bright with realization. Sir, if they produce these by the thousands, no pilot on Earth can match them. Not ours, not anyone's. Vogel folded his hands behind his back. You've just seen the future, Major. It's made of aluminum and built by factories that never sleep. Over the next few days, Lurk and the engineers tore deeper into the Thunderbolt systems. They studied the supercharger, which allowed the aircraft to maintain power at high altitudes, a design so advanced that it made Luftwaffe engines look primitive. They examined the radio system, far more reliable than German equipment. Even the oxygen system was efficient and easy to operate. Every discovery was a revelation and a warning. By the fifth day, Lurk requested permission to fly one final time, a long-range endurance test. Vogel hesitated but agreed. Just remember, he said, it's still an enemy's weapon. Lurk nodded. Then maybe it will tell us how to fight him better. He took off into the afternoon sky, heading west, toward the fading sun. For 2 hours, he tested the range, the climb, the controls, everything performed flawlessly. The Thunderbolt seemed unstoppable. But then, something unexpected happened. The radio crackled. A voice, faint but clear, came through, speaking English. Unidentified aircraft, this is Blue, leader of the 78th Fighter Group. Identify yourself. Lurk froze. He was close, too close to Allied airspace. His hands tightened on the stick. He hesitated for a second before replying, switching to broken English. Experimental aircraft. German test. No hostility. There was a pause, then the voice again. You're flying one of ours, aren't you? Lurk didn't answer. He banked hard and turned east. For a brief moment, he imagined what the American pilot must be thinking, seeing one of his own planes flying under enemy colors. By the time he returned to base, the sun was low, painting the horizon blood red. Vogel was waiting on the tarmac, hands behind his back. You went too far, the colonel said. Did they see you? Almost, Lurk replied. And they spoke to me. Their voices confident, relaxed. They sounded like men who already know they've won. Vogel looked away. Then perhaps the real lesson of this machine is not its metal, but its spirit. Lurk looked back at the Thunderbolt. The plane stood motionless, its paint chipped and scarred. But even silent, it seemed alive, as if it was listening. He walked around it slowly, touching the cool steel of its fuselage. "Inside this beast," he said softly, "I felt something we no longer have. Not arrogance, not power, just certainty." Vogel nodded gravely. "And that, Major, may be the most dangerous weapon of all." The hangar lights dimmed as evening fell. The engineers packed up their notes, their tools clattering in the silence. Outside, the sirens began to wail. Another Allied bombing raid approaching from the west. Lurk looked one last time at the Thunderbolt, its shadow stretching across the hangar floor. Then he whispered to himself, "We've learned what's inside the beast, but it's not ours to control." As the air raid sirens grew louder, he walked out into the night. Behind him, the captured Thunderbolt gleamed faintly under the moonlight, a silent symbol of the new world rising from the ashes of the old. Winter had begun to tighten its grip on northern Germany. The runways at Rechlin were often covered in frost by dawn, and the distant rumble of Allied bombers had become as regular as the tolling of a church bell. Yet within the secret hangars of the Luftwaffe's testing grounds, a strange kind of energy filled the air. Colonel Heinrich Vogel stood over a table covered with maps, technical drawings, and coded documents. Around him were the leading engineers of the Reich's Aeronautical Division. And at the center of it all, the captured P-47 Thunderbolt, its metallic body gleaming like a trophy of war. The colonel's voice was calm, deliberate. "Gentlemen, this aircraft is not merely a prize. It is a doorway. The Americans have built something we can't match in numbers, but perhaps we can learn from it." An engineer raised his head. "Sir, the Thunderbolt's design philosophy contradicts ours. It's heavy, inefficient by our standards." Vogel cut him off. "Inefficient? It outclimbs half our fleet, and it dives faster than anything we have built. Efficiency is meaningless if the pilot doesn't live long enough to use it." Major Ernst Lurk, the test pilot, stood quietly near the hangar's entrance, his flight jacket still damp from the cold. He had flown the Thunderbolt for weeks now, and he knew its strengths intimately, perhaps too intimately. Vogel motioned toward him. "Major Lurk has proven this machine's resilience. He's survived dives that would tear a Focke-Wulf apart. What do you think, Major? Could our pilots handle this?" Lurk hesitated. "They could if they had the training. But it's not just about skill. This plane forgives mistakes. It's built to protect the man inside, not demand perfection from him." A murmur spread through the room. Vogel nodded slowly. "Exactly. That's the lesson. We've built aircraft for elite aces. The Americans build them for ordinary men. They are preparing for a long war, fought by thousands, not hundreds." He pointed to a section of the map, a small airfield near Kassel. "The Allies are pushing closer every day. Berlin wants results. I intend to use this Thunderbolt to our advantage, not just for study, but as a weapon." The engineers exchanged uneasy glances. "A weapon, sir? You mean to fly it in combat?" "Yes," Vogel said sharply. "We'll disguise it, no markings, no insignia. It can fly among their formations, unnoticed for a time. If we can get it close enough, perhaps it can sow confusion, even shoot down a few before they realize." Lurk frowned. "Sir, that's suicide. The moment they see the wrong maneuver or hear the wrong call sign, they'll know. And if they capture me..." Vogel turned toward him, his expression cold but steady. "You've already flown it better than they ever expected. If anyone can pull this off, it's you." For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence was broken only by the hum of generators and the soft ticking of a clock. Finally, Lurk said, "You're asking me to become one of them." Vogel nodded. "Yes, for a single mission. Not to kill, to learn. We'll record everything. Formation patterns, radio frequencies, tactics. This isn't just about a plane, Major. It's about understanding the mind of the enemy." That night, Lurk couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside his quarters, rattling the thin window panes. He sat by the small desk, staring at the flight jacket draped over the chair. The American star, freshly painted for camouflage, gleamed faintly in the lamplight. He thought of the men who had once flown this machine. Somewhere out there, the original pilot might have been killed or captured, never knowing his plane would serve the enemy. By dawn, he made his decision. The next morning, the hangar was alive with motion. Mechanics worked quietly, repainting the P-47 in its original U.S. markings. Vogel supervised every detail. The Luftwaffe insignias were covered, the serial numbers repainted, and new call signs were stenciled on the fuselage. WZP, 78th Fighter Group. Vogel handed Lurk a small radio transmitter. "We've intercepted their communication frequencies. You'll listen, not talk. Stay high, stay behind them. If they get suspicious, dive out and head east." Lurk took a deep breath. "And if I don't come back? Then we'll know the risk was worth it," Vogel said flatly. As the engines roared to life, the hangar doors opened to reveal a frozen runway bathed in pale morning light. The Thunderbolt's propeller spun faster, sending a gust of icy air through the hangar. Vogel stepped back, watching as the machine began to move. Lurk lifted off, climbing steadily into the gray clouds above. At 20,000 feet, he switched to the captured Allied frequency. Voices filled his headset, calm, confident, utterly unaware. "Blue Squadron, Titan formation. Bandits reported near Hamburg." He adjusted his heading, following the sound of their chatter. Within minutes, he spotted them. A formation of Mustangs, their silver bodies glinting against the clouds. For the first time, a German pilot flew among them. He kept his distance, mimicking their maneuvers, copying their formation. For nearly 15 minutes, he remained undetected. Then one of the Mustangs veered slightly, as if inspecting him. Lurk's heart pounded. "Hey, new guy!" A voice crackled over the radio. "Where's your squadron? You're flying a little off." Lurk froze, unsure whether to respond. Then he pressed the switch, forcing his German accent into something faintly American. Mechanical trouble. Just catching up." "Copy that," came the reply. "Stay tight. We're heading for Bremen sector." He exhaled slowly. The disguise had worked for now. He watched as the Allied formation banked toward the horizon, the sunlight flashing across their wings. Their discipline, their coordination, the effortless confidence in their voices. It struck him deeply. They weren't just soldiers. They were part of a machine, one too vast, too relentless for Germany to stop. After nearly an hour, Lurk turned back east, recording every radio call, every formation pattern. He landed at Rechlin just before dusk, his fuel nearly gone. Vogel met him at the runway. "Well?" Lurk removed his headset, his expression unreadable. "They didn't notice. Not once. I flew with them, listened to their commands. I even heard them joke." "What did they say?" Vogel asked. Lurk looked toward the hangar. "They said they'd be home for Christmas." The colonel said nothing. For a moment, the two men simply stood in silence, the winter wind howling across the airfield. Finally, Vogel turned to his men. "Prepare the reports. Every detail. We'll send them to Berlin tonight." As he walked away, Lurk remained near the plane. He placed a hand on its cold metal surface and whispered, "You were never meant to fight for us." That night, he dreamed of flying again. But this time, the sky was filled not with enemies, but with ghosts. The winter sky over northern Germany was pale and empty, the kind of gray that seemed to drain all color from the world. Beneath it, the captured P-47 Thunderbolt waited on the icy runway at Rechlin. Its American markings gleamed faintly under the morning light, the white star inside a blue circle, the serial numbers carefully restored by Luftwaffe mechanics. Anyone looking from above would never have guessed it was the enemy's prize. Major Ernst Lurk stood beside the aircraft, tightening his gloves. He had flown it before, studied it, tested it, even risked his life in it. But today was different. Today, the Thunderbolt was not just a test subject. It was bait. Colonel Heinrich Vogel approached, his boots crunching on the frost. "You'll fly west again," he said quietly. "They'll be looking for you now, but they won't expect their own fighter to carry our eyes." Lurk gave a short nod. His voice was steady, but there was something behind his eyes, the weight of a man who knew too much. "You want me to cross deeper this time?" "Yes," Vogel replied. "The last flight gave us positions and frequencies. This time we need behavior, how they react, how they hunt." Lurk looked toward the sky. "And if they notice, then you become what they fear most, a ghost among their own." The engines roared to life, a sound too familiar to be comforting. Mechanics stepped back as the propeller blurred into motion. The ground crew saluted, and Lurk pulled his goggles down. Moments later, the P-47 thundered down the runway and lifted into the cold air, disappearing into the clouds. At first, the world below was silent. Frozen forests, thin rivers winding through snow. But soon the radio came alive with English voices. He tuned in carefully, adjusting the frequency until he caught the chatter of Allied pilots patrolling near the Dutch border. "Blue leader to all units. Maintain altitude 18,000 feet. Report any bogeys." Lurk smiled faintly. He had memorized their slang, their cadence. He slid into formation several hundred meters above a group of Mustangs. From their angle, his Thunderbolt was just another silver bird glinting in the pale sun. He matched their movements perfectly, banking, diving, reforming. To them, he was just another pilot in the endless rhythm of patrol. But inside his cockpit, every second felt stolen. Every maneuver was a lie. At one point, a Mustang drifted close, the pilot waving briefly through the canopy. Lurk returned the gesture, suppressing a strange feeling of guilt. These weren't faceless enemies now. They were men like him, trusting the sky, trusting each other. For an hour, he flew among them unnoticed. He recorded everything: radio discipline, engine response, fuel efficiency. But his mission was about to turn dangerous. "Blue leader to all radar contact. Unknown bogeys heading east. Possible Luftwaffe interceptors." The formation tightened. Lurk's heart raced. If they encountered real German fighters, he'd be forced into the ultimate illusion, fighting against his own. Moments later, he saw them. 3 FW-190s, slicing through the clouds like hunting hawks. They didn't know he was friendly. To them, every P-47 was an enemy to destroy. "Bandits! Break formation!" shouted one of the Mustang pilots. The sky exploded into chaos, engines roaring, tracers streaking past. Lurk rolled sharply left, diving with the group, trying to stay invisible. 1 FW-190 banked toward him, guns flashing. Bullets tore through the wingtip of the Thunderbolt. Smoke curled past the canopy. "Got one on me!" an Allied pilot yelled. Lurk cursed under his breath. He couldn't return fire without revealing everything. The German pilot pressed his attack, not realizing who was inside the American machine. Then instinct took over. Lurk yanked the stick and rolled into a steep dive, pulling the Thunderbolt's heavy frame into maneuvers no German plane could match. The FW-190 followed, but too fast, too hard. At 600 miles an hour, its wings began to tremble. Seconds later, it broke off, trailing smoke as it vanished into the clouds. Lurk leveled out, panting. The Allied formation was scattering, but none had turned on him. To them, he was still one of their own, another pilot fighting the Luftwaffe. He stayed with them until the last moment, then peeled away quietly, climbing eastward through the cloud cover. When he landed back at Rechlin, mechanics rushed forward. The aircraft was riddled with holes. Colonel Vogel appeared moments later, his face unreadable. "Report," he said. Lurk removed his helmet slowly. "We blended in," he said. "Completely. They never suspected. But the Germans almost shot me down." Vogel frowned. "So they couldn't tell?" "No one could. Not friend, not foe. For an hour, I was both." Vogel looked at the damaged Thunderbolt, smoke still rising from its wing. "Then the disguise works," he said quietly. Lurk hesitated. "It works too well, Colonel. Up there, it's hard to remember which side you're on." That night, as he wrote his flight report, Lurk could still hear the English voices in his head. Laughing, calling, completely unaware. The memory of the Mustang pilot's wave haunted him. He had waved back, and for a moment he had felt like one of them. Outside, the wind howled over the frozen airfield. Inside the hangar, mechanics began repairing the Thunderbolt again, its American star shining faintly through the dust. The disguise had worked perfectly, but as Vogel stared at the machine through the window, even he wondered, was this success or something more dangerous? A weapon that could wear any mask could also turn against its master. And far away, in the skies over Europe, Allied pilots were already reporting strange sightings. A lone P-47 that flew like a German ace, fought like a ghost, and then vanished into the clouds. The Americans began calling it the Phantom Thunderbolt, and the legend was just beginning. The skies over northern Germany had grown quieter. By early 1945, the once roaring air battles that shook the clouds were now rarer, shorter, and more one-sided. The Allies owned the air. German fighters flew only when absolutely necessary, short, desperate missions launched from hidden runways, their numbers dwindling each week. At the Rechlin test airfield, the captured P-47 Thunderbolt sat beneath a tarpaulin, streaked with oil and ash. For days, no one had touched it. Its last mission had nearly destroyed it, and the engineers were waiting for new parts that might never arrive. Fuel was scarce. So was hope. Colonel Heinrich Vogel paced inside his office, staring at a pile of reports. The room was cold. The heating system had failed again, and the only sound was the faint ticking of his pocket watch. Each tick reminded him that time was running out. Major Ernst Lurk entered quietly, saluting. His face was gaunt, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. "You asked for me, sir?" Vogel nodded. "Yes, I've been reviewing your last flight logs. You saw something unusual, didn't you?" Lurk hesitated. "Not unusual, just different. The Americans are no longer chasing kills. They're escorting bombers, thousands of them, in perfect lines. They fly high, steady, disciplined. It's like the sky itself belongs to them." Vogel looked up from his desk. "And what of our operations?" Lurk's voice lowered. "Our planes can't even reach them anymore. Every climb drains what little fuel we have. The few who make contact don't come back." There was a long silence. Outside, the wind howled through the bare trees, and snow began to fall across the empty runway. Vogel spoke softly. Berlin wants another report on the Thunderbolt. They still think it can give us an advantage. Lurk sighed. An advantage against what? Their machines? Their numbers? Their fuel? Or their factories that never stop? The colonel leaned back in his chair. You don't believe in the mission anymore. I believe in surviving, Lurk said quietly. But this plane, this prize, it's not saving us. It's teaching us how far behind we are. The colonel's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew Lurk was right. The Thunderbolt had revealed truths they weren't ready to face. Truths about engineering, production, endurance. The Luftwaffe had been built on skill and brilliance. The Allies had built theirs on endless strength. That night, Vogel wrote his final transmission to Berlin. It was short, precise, and strangely poetic. The Thunderbolt performs beyond expectation. The silence in the dive is deceptive. It falls like a storm, calm from above, destruction below. A weapon of endurance, not glory. He didn't mention that they could no longer test it. Fuel reserves were being redirected to the front lines. A few days later, a sudden air raid shattered the quiet. Allied bombers roared above Rechlin, dropping their payloads with mechanical precision. Explosions ripped through hangars, runways, and barracks. The once secret heart of German aviation became a field of fire. Lurk ran toward the hangar where the Thunderbolt was kept. Flames were spreading fast. "Get the crew out!" he shouted. The ground shook as another wave of bombs fell nearby. He found the plane half buried under debris, one wing torn open. The painted American star was scorched, almost invisible beneath soot and ash. For a moment he froze. This machine, once a symbol of discovery and deceit, now lay broken like everything else. Colonel Vogel appeared beside him, coughing from the smoke. "Leave it, Ernst. It's over." But Lurk shook his head. "No, not yet." He climbed onto the wreckage, trying to reach the cockpit. A second explosion threw him to the ground. When he opened his eyes, the Thunderbolt was burning, its ammunition cooking off in sharp, staccato bursts. Vogel dragged him away. Together, they watched as the plane melted into the earth, the flames rising like a funeral pyre. "It's gone," Vogel said quietly. Lurk stared into the fire. "Then maybe that's for the best." When the bombing stopped, Rechlin was nothing but ruins. Dozens were dead. The rest scattered into the forests. The Thunderbolt, the enemy's secret, their hope, their obsession, was gone forever. Days later, Lurk found himself stationed at a small emergency airstrip near Magdeburg. The war was collapsing. Soviet tanks were crossing the Oder. Allied bombers flew freely over the heart of Germany, their engines droning like an endless storm. He no longer flew missions. Instead, he stood outside the crumbling control tower each night, staring at the empty sky. It was quiet now, too quiet. No German engines, no flak, no distant thunder of defense. "Silence from above," he whispered. "That's when you know it's over." He thought about the American pilots he had flown among. Their voices, their laughter, their easy confidence. They had seemed untouchable then. Now he understood why. They were never fighting for survival. They were fighting for inevitability. One morning, a courier arrived with a message from Vogel. "The project is closed. Burn all remaining documents. History will forget what we learned here." Lurk folded the note and placed it inside his jacket pocket. History, he thought, might forget, but he wouldn't. In the final days of the war, Allied pilots reported seeing strange wreckage scattered across northern Germany. Pieces of a fighter that didn't belong to either side. A few fragments were collected. A radial engine unlike any German design. A section of fuselage painted with both a swastika and an American star. To them, it was a mystery, a ghost from the sky that had fought under two flags and belonged to neither. As the snow melted and the ruins of Rechlin fell silent, the wind carried only the faint smell of fuel and burnt metal. And somewhere in that silence, the story of the Thunderbolt ended, not with a final battle, but with a whisper. A whisper that said, "War isn't lost when the last shot is fired. It's lost when the sky stops answering." When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was a graveyard of steel. Burned-out tanks lined the roads, shattered wings lay across empty fields, and the sky that had once thundered with war was now eerily calm. Major Ernst Lurk walked through what remained of the Rechlin airfield weeks after the surrender. The grass had begun to grow between the cracks in the runway. Rusted hangars stood like skeletons, and the only sound was the wind moaning through twisted metal. He stopped where the captured P-47 Thunderbolt had once stood, the plane that had changed everything. Now there was only a blackened crater, filled with rainwater and ash. He knelt beside it and whispered, "You taught us more than we were ready to learn." The Allies had won, but Lurk knew that victory wasn't just about power. It was about preparation, precision, and the lessons one side refused to learn until it was too late. A few days later, Allied officers arrived to inspect the remains of Rechlin. Among them was Captain Robert Jenkins, an American engineer from the 8th Air Force. His job was to collect any surviving documents, aircraft parts, or engineers who could explain Germany's secret research programs. When Jenkins met Lurk, he was surprised. The German pilot didn't look defeated, only tired, thoughtful, as if carrying the weight of 1,000 lost flights. "You were one of the test pilots here?" Jenkins asked. Lurk nodded. "Yes, I flew your Thunderbolt." Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "Ours? You mean?" "Yes," Lurk interrupted softly. "We captured one, studied it, flew it. We tried to learn from it, but what we really learned was humility." The American looked at him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Guess that's one thing war teaches all of us." They walked together through the ruins. Jenkins took notes, photographed wreckage, and carefully collected surviving blueprints. Most of them were useless now, half-burned, covered in soot. But every scrap of information mattered. When they reached the edge of the airfield, Jenkins turned to Lurk. "Do you regret it?" he asked. Lurk looked toward the horizon, where the last plumes of smoke from the war still drifted faintly. "I regret that we spent our genius on destruction. We could have built anything, bridges, cities, dreams. Instead, we built faster ways to die." Jenkins didn't reply. The two men stood there in silence, listening to the wind sweeping across the empty hangars. A wind that once carried the sound of engines, now carrying only ghosts. Months passed. Germany was divided, its people struggling to rebuild. Lurk found work helping Allied engineers understand the Luftwaffe's test data. It wasn't collaboration. It was redemption. He spent his days explaining aerodynamics, testing procedures, and the failures no one had dared to record. Sometimes he was asked about the Thunderbolt, the captured American plane. Each time his answer was the same. It wasn't just a machine. It was a message, one we ignored until it was too late. At night, he stayed in a small wooden cabin near Lake Muritz. He wrote letters that he never sent, to the men he'd flown with, to the engineers who died in bombings, and to his wife who had been killed in an air raid 2 years earlier. One letter read, "I've learned that the sky remembers everything. Every scream, every dive, every fireball. They don't vanish. They echo. Maybe that's why it's so quiet now. It's listening." In 1947, Lurk was quietly recruited by the Americans under Operation Paperclip, though not for weapons, for aviation research. They wanted to know how the Germans had developed jet propulsion so quickly, how they tested extreme speeds, and how they had survived under impossible conditions. He agreed to go, but only under one condition. He would work on aircraft meant for exploration, not destruction. When he arrived at a U.S. airbase in Dayton, Ohio, he saw something that stopped him cold: a P-47 Thunderbolt, gleaming in the sunlight. It looked identical to the one he had flown years earlier, except this one bore no scars of war. Its surface shone like a promise. A young mechanic noticed him staring. "Beautiful, isn't she?" Lurk nodded slowly. "Yes," and mercifully silent. The mechanic laughed. "Silent? You've never heard one of these babies at full throttle." Lurk smiled faintly. "Oh, I have. More than once." Years later, in the 1950s, the jet age had begun. The lessons from both sides, American endurance and German engineering, had merged into something new. Lurk watched the first test flights of experimental jets with mixed emotions. The engines screamed like thunder. The wings sliced through clouds faster than sound. And though these machines were built for peace, he could still sense the ghosts of their origins. He kept a journal during those years, recording his thoughts. "Every breakthrough we celebrate comes from a lesson learned in blood. The sky teaches, but it never forgives." When he retired, he returned to Germany. The Rechlin airfield was gone, overgrown with grass and birch trees. Only the faint outline of the old runways remained, scars on the land, visible only from above. He stood where the Thunderbolt had once burned and listened to the wind. It was calm, peaceful. Birds nested in the trees. Children played in the distance. For the first time, the silence above felt comforting. He whispered, "Maybe this is what victory truly sounds like." In his final years, Lurk gave interviews to historians and aviation students. He never spoke of politics, only of flight. "The greatest lesson of the war," he said once, "was not how to build better planes. It was how to stop building them for the wrong reasons." When he passed away in 1972, the only item found on his desk was a faded photograph, a black and white image of the captured Thunderbolt at Rechlin, half covered in snow. On the back, in his handwriting, were 5 simple words: "Never forget what silence costs." Decades later, when historians revisited the ruins of Rechlin, they found almost nothing left. But local villagers spoke of a strange sound that sometimes came from the sky. Not thunder, not wind, but a low, distant hum, like an engine fading into memory. Perhaps it was nothing, or perhaps the sky, even now, was remembering, because some lessons are never forgotten. The sky above northern Germany was pale and silent on that spring morning in 1945. The war was nearly over, but the air still carried the smell of oil, smoke, and loss. Across the crumbling airfields of the Reich, the Luftwaffe was breathing its last. What had once been an empire of the sky was now reduced to scattered wrecks, grounded dreams, and pilots with nowhere left to go. At Rechlin, the secret testing ground, Major Ernst Lurk received one final order, a mission that made no sense. He was to fly the captured American P-47 Thunderbolt one last time and deliver it to a safe site further south before Allied troops arrived. He knew it was impossible. Fuel was scarce. Allied aircraft ruled the sky, and the front lines were collapsing faster than anyone could track. But orders were orders, and perhaps deep down he wanted one last flight, not for his country but for the sky itself. The ground crew gathered silently as Lurk walked toward the plane. The Thunderbolt stood there like a wounded animal, patched with German markings, its metal skin scarred by battle and experiments. The morning mist clung to its wings. "Are you sure about this, Herr Major?" a mechanic asked quietly. Lurk nodded. "She deserves to fly one last time." He climbed into the cockpit, his gloved hands brushing over the American dials and switches he had learned by heart. Every gauge told a story of power, of engineering, of the strange kinship between enemies who had both reached for the same sky. As the engine roared to life, the crew stepped back. The sound shook the air, deep, defiant, alive. Birds scattered from the nearby trees. For a moment, it felt like the war had vanished, replaced by the raw beauty of flight. Then, with a final salute to the men below, Lurk pushed the throttle forward. The thunderbolt began to roll. He lifted off into the gray clouds, the airfield shrinking beneath him. The countryside below was torn and broken. Rivers clogged with bridges, towns reduced to ruins. Smoke rose from the horizon like black ghosts. The radio crackled faintly with Allied chatter in English. He didn't answer. He simply climbed higher, higher into the thin, cold air. The plane felt heavy, unbalanced, part American, part German, belonging fully to neither. Yet somehow it flew smoother than ever. Lurk smiled faintly. "You were built to survive," he whispered. For a while he just flew, not toward the destination but toward peace. Every mile carried him further from the ruins of a world that had destroyed itself. He thought of the men who had died testing this machine, of the engineers who had studied it in secret, and of the thousands who had fought without ever knowing why. The thunderbolt sliced through the clouds like a silver blade, its engine humming with purpose. But then, out of the mist, he saw them. 3 American P-51 Mustangs, circling like hawks. He froze. There was nowhere to hide. The radio buzzed again, this time clearer. "Unidentified aircraft, this is Eagle Squadron. Identify yourself immediately." Lurk hesitated. What could he possibly say? That he was a German flying an American fighter? That he wasn't an enemy, just a man trying to give the sky one last salute? He pressed the transmitter. "This is Thunderbolt on final flight. Do not engage." Silence. Then, confusion in English voices. "Say again? Did he say Thunderbolt? That's one of ours." Before they could react, Lurk dipped his wings in a gesture of peace. But the sky was unforgiving. One of the Mustangs, mistaking his movement for evasion, fired a warning burst. Tracers flashed past the canopy. The thunderbolt shook. A round struck near the tail, smoke trailing behind. Lurk steadied the controls. His breathing slowed. He didn't return fire. He didn't even try to escape. Instead, he leveled the plane and opened the throttle to its limit. One last run into eternity. He dove beneath the clouds, the world turning into a blur of fields and rivers. The damaged engine screamed in protest, but he kept flying. Below, farmers looked up, startled by the roar. A sound they hadn't heard since the height of the war. For a moment, it was 1943 again, the skies alive, the air electric with power and fear. And then, as the engine began to fail, Lurk smiled to himself. "This is where I belong," he whispered. The thunderbolt coughed, sputtered, and finally went silent. The propeller slowed. The world grew still. He glided low over a lake, its surface smooth as glass, and gently pulled back the stick. The plane skimmed the water like a bird touching down for the last time, then disappeared in a spray of mist. Hours later, local villagers found the wreck. The plane had slid to rest near the shore, its fuselage cracked but mostly intact. Inside, Lurk's body was still strapped in, his face calm, eyes closed as if dreaming. There was no insignia, no flag, no sign of allegiance. Only the faint smell of fuel and the whisper of waves. When Allied troops arrived days later, they were puzzled. The serial numbers matched an American aircraft lost over France 2 years earlier. But there were traces of German instrumentation, markings, and notes written in both languages. One officer simply said, "Maybe the war ended a little earlier for him." They buried Lurk nearby, under a birch tree by the water. The inscription on his cross read only, "He flew for the sky." Years passed. The war faded into memory. The story of the German pilot in the American plane became a quiet legend, retold by farmers, then historians, then pilots who felt the strange echo of that final flight whenever they looked down at the world from above. In the 1960s, a young German pilot training with NATO visited the lake where the Thunderbolt had crashed. He stood by the water and said softly, "We fly together now, all of us." The air was still. The reflection of clouds rippled across the lake, and somewhere, far away, the faint sound of an old engine seemed to hum, just for a moment before fading into silence. In the decades that followed, aviation museums displayed the recovered fragments of the Thunderbolt. One piece of metal, burned and twisted, still bore a hand-carved inscription scratched with a pilot's knife. "The sky remembers." Visitors often paused before that piece, not for the technology, not for the war, but for the quiet truth behind those words. The echo of that flight, the flight of a man caught between two worlds, two flags, and one sky, still lived on. And every time a plane passed high above the clouds, breaking the silence with the roar of engines, it carried with it a whisper from the past. Never forget what the sky costs. Echoes of the final flight wasn't just the end of a story. It was the closing breath of an era, a reminder that even in the ashes of war, there are moments of beauty, courage, and grace that belong to no nation, only to the sky itself.